Hi, everyone. Welcome to Strategic Dialogues, a new series from the Stimson Center and the Strategic Learning Initiative. Strategic Dialogues brings you candid conversations every month with regional experts on the most pressing security issues in Southern Asia, with a focus on strategic and nuclear dynamics. As I said, a new episode will air every month, and we hope that whether you're already a member of the strategic learning community or just joining us, you'll find value in this series. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the Strategic Learning Initiative, it is a flagship project of our South Asia program here at the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C. And the reason behind it is we think strategic and nuclear knowledge is not innate, that leaders, that analysts, that institutions and state learn these key concepts over time. And here at Stimson South Asia program, we've worked to create free courses and resources that help explain these concepts and provide students and analysts access to a wide range of expert perspectives on matters of deterrence and strategy. And that is the outgrowth of this new series of interviews that we decided to conduct. And I can think of no better first guest to welcome to help to take us through some of the evolving regional strategic and deterrence dynamics than Dr. Rajagopalan, who has so kindly joined us here on this conversation today. She is a resident senior fellow with the Australian Strategic Policy Institute's Cyber Technology and Security Program. Prior to joining ASPI, she was the director of the Center for Security, Strategy, and Technology at the Observer Research Foundation, and has served in high-level roles in the Indian government and the United Nations bodies as an expert on strategic technologies in the Indo-Pacific. So Raji, thank you so much for being with us, for taking the time. It's wonderful to have a chance to talk with you from half a world away. How is everything in Australia? How are you doing?
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. It's a great, it's an enormous pleasure to be part of this conversation. Yeah, it's been fantastic, and we just watched the Australian Prime Minister in DC. That meeting seemed to have gone well because it took several months to for that meeting to happen. So there was a certain amount of sort of restlessness, nervousness about it, but it seemed to have gone well. So looking forward to some great collaboration in the Indo-Pacific and a lot of thematic issues as well. Yeah.
Absolutely. We have a lot to unpack today.
Yeah.
And I think it will surprise no one to say that regional security dynamics are moving at breakneck speed right now. It can feel somewhat difficult to keep up. And even more specifically in the Southern Asia context, the recent Indian-Pakistan crisis was a real watershed moment in many ways. The most serious military conflict between two nuclear armed powers in several decades, at least, some would say, actually, of all time. And the crisis may have ended with a ceasefire, but all parties will be applying lessons for the next conflict for the years ahead. And Raji, I'm so glad to have you with us today on Strategic Dialogues to unpack some of those lessons learned and place them in the broader context of the topics that we focus on in depth through strategic learning. And maybe to kick things off, if I can ask you to zoom out a little bit. We think sometimes as a program and as an initiative about this idea of strategic learning and nuclear learning, right? Like, what are the processes of learning lessons from crises, and how states come to terms with their nuclear capabilities with strategic dynamics. And I just wonder if I can ask you to go into reflective mode at the outset here and tell us a little bit about how you think about the process of nuclear learning that plays out in Southern Asia. And how does it change from kind of crisis to crisis, and anything that jumped out at you from this crisis that you think is particularly notable in that context?
No, no, thanks, Elizabeth. That's a great question to talk. And I think this is an issue that we can talk for several hours. But I will keep it brief. I think the process of strategic learning, you can actually take it back to the 1980s, the 1987 Operation Brass Tag. So there are different lessons from the 1980s onwards, if one were to kind of chronicle. But I think the main learning is that if the Indian concern, for instance, has been that there is no way around Pakistan use of nuclear blackmailing, the threat of nuclear escalation. And that, I think, did hold back India for a very long time. So multiple sub-conventional conflicts, terrorism incidents that have happened, but India did not have a way out of Pakistan's nuclear rhetoric and how any Indian retaliation to a subconventional conflict, the number of cross-border terrorism could escalate to a nuclear level. So that was the thinking for a very long time. By 1999, India did believe that it can still use force as long as it's within its borders and don't cross the border. So there you did have a full-fledged war, but again, there were limits within which India was operating. India tried to do something different with Operation Parakram 2001, 2002 in response to the Indian Parliament attack in 2001 December. Again, India did a massive 10-month-long troop mobilization against Pakistan, essentially a compellence strategy. But again, Pakistan also stood fast and stood the ground and did not really give up. So that really did not provide India with a sort of an effective strategy to deal with Pakistan's subconventional conflicts in a sense. Next 10 years, we don't see much change. India was essentially unable to develop an effective strategy against Pakistan conventional conflict strategy, which was considered a state tool against India. The change began to appear in 2016 when the Uri attack happened. And by then in Delhi, you have the Modi government at the center. And in response to Uri attack, India undertook what is called the surgical strikes. Again, even in response to the 2008 terrorist attacks, I have seen some reports of even the UPA government carrying out covert attacks. But again, those are just merely reports. But for the first time, you did see the India undertaking the surgical strikes and taking credit for that in a sense. But this was no full-scale attack, and this was not a full-scale change of the Indian approach either. It was defensible, only targeting Pakistan terror camps and terror hideouts. So again, keeping in some limits, even as it is showing that it is willing to escalate. In a way, from 2016 onwards, India has been demonstrating that it will respond to Pakistan's acts of terror within certain limits. And of course, then comes the 2019, the Balakot airstrikes, where one step higher with the use of air power on Pakistan territory, because surgical strikes were essentially only in POK, Pakistan occupied Kashmir, and they were commando strike and not an air strike. So with each of the events, what we are saying is India is taking one step higher and escalating in a sense. And of course, by May 2025, you have a full-scale attack across multiple air bases, including ones that hold Pakistan's nuclear weapons, at least based on reports. But these were not sustained attacks, but more to show that India can carry out these strikes deep inside Pakistan territory. Still, I would say there was some effort at controlling, because if you look at the Indian Foreign Secretary's statements, where he's went on to say, even after 2 weeks, Pakistan establishment has only engaged in denials and allegations, and that there were Indian intel reports that have suggested that there are going to be more terror strikes, attacks on India. And thus, this was more of a compulsion both to deter as well as to preempt. Then you have the 7th May early morning strikes, and again the Indian Foreign Secretary statement that the attacks were measured, non-escalatory, proportionate, and responsible. And he went on to add that these attacks were focused on dismantling terror infrastructure and disabling the terrorists likely to be sent over to India. Again, in an unprecedented fashion, he also added that the preemptive strikes were allowed under international law using the Article 51 of the UN Charter, essentially. So India was trying to cover the base very well, saying that this is still within the limits and India had the right to sort of retaliate in a sense. For Pakistan, I would think it's a very different kind of understanding that it has come to from these several conflicts that have happened over the years. One, I think that nuclear weapons are not useful in blackmail or escalation with India. Earlier, it worked because it did prevent, it showed restraint on the part of India. It prevented India from responding and escalating the situation. So therefore, it was in favor of Pakistan. But I think they They tried something different. They also tried coercion. The Kargil war was different, but they again have subsequently gone back to deniable terror attacks as the strategy, because Pakistan is increasingly seeing that it is not helping Pakistan's objective of preventing India from attacking. And I think now I would think this is possibly again under question because India is retaliating, whether it is to conventional, subconventional, all of that. There's a lot that India can learn again that from attacking Pakistan's air bases. But I think one area where India lost is the narrative war. And that is an area that Pakistan did a great job, even as it suffered losses. I think their narrative efforts where you need to give them almost 10 out of 10 in a sense. So next time, I would think India could be much more fierce in terms of an attack on Pakistan. India also is reported to be engaged in covert attacks. So now Pakistan possibly does not have an effective response to India's willingness to escalate and how things would pan out. It's remains somewhat unclear in a sense. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It's a really useful laydown, and I think the progression from crisis to crisis, going all the way back to the 1980s, right before either power was an
Nuclear.
overt nuclear power, is remarkable. I wonder then, as you think about that change over time, how significant a leap did we see back in May? Does this feel again, like kind of an evolution, but a step along the way? Or did this feel somehow different to you in terms of either India's approach, the escalation risk that came along with that, right? Because when you think about calling nuclear bluffs,
Yeah.
there's risk involved there. So help us understand, kind of put the crisis in context in terms of how meaningfully different it was or wasn't from what we've seen before.
No, I think India slowly has realized that it can respond more vigorously.
Mm-hmm.
So the Indian approach has evolved from covert commando strikes to overt commando attacks to Balakot air strikes to on terror infrastructure within POK to limited direct attacks on Pakistan air bases within Pakistani territory. This clearly represents a slow escalation each time, but to me, it would seem like a logically looking at it, next time could be much worse, much more fierce in terms of the attacks on Pakistan. So I think India believes that it has taken a calculated risk in terms of how far it can go, in terms of intensifying and stepping up the nature of attacks and so on and so forth, and Pakistan. And I think you look back at various crises that have happened even after the two countries going nuclear. The two countries, the two leadership in both countries have shown that they have capacity to engage in conventional military conflicts
Mm-hmm.
under a nuclear umbrella. So I think this also again comes out very clear that they do have the stomach to engage in a conventional conflict without resorting to nuclear use in a sense.
Yeah. I want to take you to one specific part of the crisis because I think it's important to say, at least from my perspective, humility is still in order, right? We're putting the pieces together and trying to figure out exactly what happened. It will be long in the future when we actually have access to what was going on behind the scenes. But with all of that, one of those moments in the crisis where um, I really found myself thinking this feels quite different and different in a way that carries with it really substantial risks. Was the night of May 7th, right? When we started to see these more significant strikes into parts of Pakistan that India had not previously targeted in greater scale, kind of crossing thresholds, including into interior portions of Punjab province, like very sensitive sites, relatively speaking, in kind of the signaling hierarchy that has predominated in the past, right? You mentioned the 2019 crisis where India struck outside of Pakistan administered Kashmir for the first time in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province, but this was different. And I wonder, thinking about that night, was there anything there that struck you? And was there a moment in that escalation process, um, either on that night or more broadly, where you felt like something had meaningfully changed? And do you have a sense of why that happened? Was that an intentional choice, or at some point was there a process of kind of the crisis generated a momentum of its own and became harder to direct from the outside necessarily?
No, I think, yeah, absolutely. You are right. It's because I remember talking to several Australian journalists going on to TV shows and kind of thing. And it did look like maybe things would calm down after the initial spate of
Yeah.
attacks and counterattacks and be done with it. But of course, first was it escalated. India did with the seventh early morning attack on
Yeah.
the terror infrastructure. Seventh night, you have the Pakistan shooting down Indian fighter jets. Again, the
Yeah.
timelines are a little hazy and all over
Yeah.
the place. But then you did see seventh and eighth night continued drone and missile firing, as well as artillery shelling continuing in different parts of Jammu and Kashmir by and large. But ninth night, India decided, and India did carry out major strikes on Pakistan's air bases and other military facilities. And then, of course, by 10th evening, Indian Standard Time or the South Asian
Mhm.
Time, you have the ceasefire statement coming out from the Indian Foreign Secretary. So the initial attacks to me were planned attacks, and Pakistan knew what to expect, so they were prepared. They knew they need to respond. They knew that India would respond, and that they had to be prepared for that attack.
Mhm.
So therefore, they were able to bring down the Indian fighter jets. And but the message that for India was that Pakistan was clear that it was going to escalate. It was escalating. So once the Pakistani intention to escalate became clear, India decided that it had to escalate as well. So it
Mhm.
was more of an action reaction phenomena implications that we were seeing that were playing out. But I think now we have seen several cases. The US strikes on Iran nuclear sites, Middle East, Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Israel case, and of course the Ukraine situation. Somehow, escalation isn't seen as with the same amount of scare or
Yeah.
the worrying concern the way it used to be earlier, in a sense. So recent cases are evidence of the fact that how escalation can happen without resorting to use of nuclear weapons in
Mhm.
the South Asian context, or without resorting to it becoming an open, wider conflict in a sense. And the Hamas and Hezbollah, the Middle East situation, the Israeli strikes on them being is an excellent example of
Yeah.
things need not spread to a wider conflict in a sense. Strike on Iran nuclear sites, again, the US strike. So we're seen as going to be escalatory. The Iranians are going to respond in disproportionate manner and so on and so forth, that it would lead to a bigger conflict. But again, that did not happen. Ukraine
Mhm.
also the same situation. So the conclusion is to find a way around for India is to find a way around without escalation and without it leading to wider conflicts. So I think the excessive fear around escalation is no longer there. But again, this is not to suggest that we can take it easy and
Yeah.
this is all risk free in a sense. And others can actually get emboldened to carry out very risky options, very riskier kind of strategies put in place, and things could actually spiral out of control. So
Mhm.
escalation possibilities to me always do exist, but some of the earlier concerns might have been a bit too exaggerated. So I think finding that right balance between we don't want an exaggerated sort of a concerns around escalation. At the same time, we need to find that sweet balance between and to in order to escalate and retaliate without making it into a wider conflict or without resorting to nuclear use and so on and so forth.
Mhm. I think that's a really good point, and an interesting bit of learning that I've done through conversations about previous crises is the role that restraint has quietly played on both sides in calibrating moves
Hmm.
and exercising some quiet escalation control, right? There is this, it's kind of a very delicate dance and an understanding that's perceived on both sides of what the relative escalation ladders look like, even though, I think there are some challenges with that example. Nonetheless, there's kind of a perception of a shared understanding of hierarchy of escalatory intent, of different moves that either side could make. One of the things that I'm concerned about and that I would love to get your sense of is as both sides move away from some of kind of the more practiced um, forms of crisis, right, where things start to look different and evolve differently in the midst of a crisis than they have in previous ones, where we get away from the script, it becomes somewhat difficult to exercise that level of restraint and have confidence that the other side knows what's coming. And I felt this in the course, the crisis, in conversations that we were having where certainly to me and to people that we were speaking with in the region, just the element of turn taking itself was contested. The Indians were denying that they had done something here, and the Pakistanis were denying that they had done something here, particularly in kind of the seventh, eighth time frame around drone strikes. This came up. And if one side is not sharing an idea of what the other side is doing, like if you don't have that mutual understanding, it strikes me that it becomes much harder to try to calibrate and ensure you're staying on the right side of controlling escalation and not tipping over into risk. How do you see that? Was that a dynamic that you saw play out in the course of this?
No, absolutely no. There could be, both sides could have gone in very riskier ventures because you did not have clear and correct information, and disinformation was at its peak during that conflict from both sides. Both India and Pakistan engaged in heavy disinformation, misinformation efforts. So, for instance, when I was tracking the news from India, for instance, or Pakistan, from India, I was looking at a handful of journalists who did by and large maintain certain amount of integrity in terms of verification of the inputs that they get, because you just could not go with any information that came through, in a sense. So you had to be very careful to see who you are following, to get that bit of credible information. And so the veracity of the information had to be verified with a lot of care, and because otherwise you can come to a very risky, very different conclusion,
Mm-hmm.
and how countries need to respond and so on and so forth. So I think that was particularly a big struggle in this
Mm.
context between, because we haven't seen this kind of an information disinformation or misinformation warfare between the two sides during the conflict. That was never the case in the past. At least I don't remember ever seeing this issue being playing out so badly between India and Pakistan during the conflict. But I think this was something that everyone had to struggle to get that credible amount of a bit of information
Yes.
on the state of the play, where attacks were happening, what, and so and that carries a huge risk if you were to go with certain wrong information and make the
Mm-hmm.
wrong judgment of that, on thinking that, oh, the Pakistanis are upping the ante, so let's give them what they need, or the Pakistani making a misreading on the Indian objectives and so on and so forth. So things could have gone terribly wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it did look like in between that things were going to go very wrong also.
Yeah.
So these are risky ventures. But so first of all, you're talking about two countries with such close physical proximity.
Yes.
Things can go wrong very badly, very quickly. So those are additional factors that we need to think about, which you didn't have to look at if you look in the Cold War kind of a
Mm-hmm.
history, you don't have the US and the Soviet Union going through this level of it. There are other covert attacks and those kind of issues that happening, but not from the kind of geographical proximity that brings about a very different set of risky sort of adventures in this part of the world. So I think, yeah, you're looking at a very dangerous, tricky situation in a sense.
Exactly. And I want to draw you out a little bit on this Cold War analogy because I think sometimes, for a
Yeah.
very long time, that was the best empirical data that we had on how to
Yeah.
manage a nuclear rivalry. And to your point, for many reasons, Southern Asian nuclear competition challenges a lot of those assumptions. There's some through lines, though, too. And so I wonder, as you reflect on the lessons learned from the Cold War in this respect and kind of getting back to this broader nuclear learning framework, how do you put the current crisis into context in terms of what's applicable, what's not, and what we're seeing play out in Southern Asia cause us to rethink about broader assumptions that we have about kind of deterrence dynamics in this new age?
No, I think by and large, when you look at it, I don't think the Cold War thinking is very, very relevant because I
Mm-hmm.
think I would say it's not a huge influence because I think Pakistan, for instance, attempted to use stability, instability paradox, that there is stability at the nuclear level, but instability at the conventional as well as kind of sub-conventional levels. But this has not really worked out, and the Cold War nuclear thinking is not exactly applicable to the Southern Asian context, very different from the US, Soviet Union. And I would not say that there's a direct learning from that. There are some broader other sort of a takeaways from that time frame and that kind of context. But the India-Pakistan situation is very different from the US, Soviet Union. India-Pakistan nuclear forces, for instance, are not on hair trigger alert, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
It is there is more of a relaxed approach, and they both sides feel that they can engage in sub-conventional conflict and still not escalate to nuclear levels because the postures are very, very different. Also, India and Pakistan have very much smaller nuclear forces. So in that sense, it may not be very relevant. And in terms of, there may be individuals who may be somewhat more influenced. Again, some being influenced, and some tend to even use the Cold War analogy and the language from that thinking. But it's not a widespread phenomena. I think most strategists would also continue to recognize that the conditions are so different, and there are limitations to applying the Cold War nuclear theory, the language. But the takeaways, for instance, are in terms of even at the height of the Cold War, there were strong direct communication channels between Soviet Union and the United States. So, and they were the hotlines and so on and so forth. Such measures that need to be replicated, for instance, in the
Mm-hmm.
case of India, Pakistan. And even if it's there, has it been in use? Has it been effectively put to use, so that you do not get into a risky option making up because you misread the situation and some things like that. So there are important takeaways from the Cold War scenario, but not exactly a direct learning, because I think it's a very different scenario as it plays
Yeah.
out in the case of India and Pakistan.
No, I think that's a great point. And I want to get to kind of the crisis communication and the managing conflict piece of this in a little bit. Before we get there, though, one of the things it's quite interesting to me looking at both this and previous India-Pakistan crises is just this notion of the differences between attacks that aim to achieve operational effects, right, with war aims, and the ones that are more used for signaling. And I wonder if there are any examples of that. First of all, do you buy into that distinction, right? Do you think that that is something that it's useful to think about from an analytical perspective? And how do we see that in the current crisis? And from there, I guess, would ask you to reflect a bit on how that plays into this broader question of escalatory risk, right? Is there a difference in signaling versus operational effects that could lead to, greater or lesser degrees of escalatory potential?
No, I think if you look at the current sort of case, the current conflict, almost everything was signaling in a sense. But for signaling to work, there had to be operational effectiveness. In a sense, I say, and therefore I would say signaling was the objective, and it was effective. It was not meant to create operational effects, because if that was the case, India would have sustained those many of the military attacks on the air bases and so on and so forth. They were just merely to send the signal to the Pakistani establishment, Pakistani authorities, that India can carry out those strikes. So in fact, the second set of attacks, the air bases and the other military facilities that came under attack, it became necessary for India to do it, because in order to strengthen the signaling, because the Indian fighter jets were shot down the 2 nights ago, and therefore India had to show that it could, gain an upper hand. It can actually engage in retaliation, and it can engage in these kind of. So operational effectiveness for me was was an essential part in order for the signaling part to be effective. So it was more of signaling, almost entirely signaling was the objective, but it had to show the operational effectiveness was an important part if the signaling had to be effective and credible in a sense. Absolutely. So
Yeah.
and the second set of attacks was like a response to show that India can retaliate. India is not going to back down because the fighter jets were brought down and kind of thing. So absolutely, yeah.
That's really helpful. And it brings to mind one of the concepts that we dig into in courses that we have and products we put out for the Strategic Learning Initiative, this idea of the eye of the beholder problem, right? And signals sent are not necessarily signals that are received. What is your sense of how effectively the signals that India was trying to send by virtue of these strikes, how were those received in Pakistan, and was there a miscommunication that happened there? In other words, like, did those strikes succeed in sending the signals that they were intended to?
I think so, because if you look at the overall effectiveness, because both sides, even when India did carry out massive, military strikes on military facilities, air bases, and kind of thing, Pakistan did have to show immediately that they also did something more to retaliate, but it was a lot more measured and calibrated, and in a sense, because it's a matter of building public perception back at home. That you did not bow down to the Indian attacks, but you also retaliated. So it was a bit of winning public opinion in a sense, but that's where I think they decided the more effective way of controlling that was also through the narrative war that they engaged in. And the narrative war, they completely won over the kind of outreach and engagement that they did to create, despite Pakistan losing so many, the air bases coming under attack and so on and so forth. The kind of image that they created about Pakistan's gains was something that was really, sort of a brilliant narrative exercise that they did, and that was one area that in Indian side lost it. I think India did in the beginning did try to do something right. They did have the foreign secretary along with him was the two military folks, two women coming to do the briefing, and I think one of them was a Muslim woman who was part of the Air Force who did the briefing. So I think India did plan and try to do something right, but it was not an effective one. I think India law, and after that again, India did the outreach by sending all political party delegations to various countries. But I think India was not particularly great. And I think I would say this also because India has not really cultivated the media houses, for instance, the Western media in particular, to engage them or cultivated them and told them their version of the story for a long time. So why would, when a crisis hits you, they will go with whatever information that they have, and Pakistanis were providing plenty of information on what their side of the story. So they would go with that particular version of the story, than because India was not coming out with a timely assessment on the situation and so on and so forth. And I think generally India's approach to Western media has also not been helpful. Banning the Twitter ID of the New York Times, Washington Post, and the like. Such steps are not helpful. You need to engage them. The narrative war is equally important if you want to kind of get your support from key powers and so on and so forth. So I think that's something that India has to do a much better job, and that's where Pakistan did a fantastic job in a sense. Yeah.
I want to nerd out with you for a little bit because you work on all things tech and cyber and emerging technologies. I would love to hear your thoughts on the role that emerging tech played in this crisis. Certainly, we saw the China-Pakistan, performance of Chinese origin hardware that Pakistan used to great effect early in this crisis in the downing of some number of Indian fighter jets. Obviously, details are just still disputed. Um, Electronic warfare, right? What was notable to you in terms of the emerging technologies here, and what might that mean going forward?
Yeah, so I work, that's another thing. Yeah, I work with ASPI's, both the
Yeah,
cyber tech and security program, but I also work with the defense and strategy program. So I work on, I wear two hats in a sense
yeah.
here at ASPI too. But yeah, absolutely. No, great question on the role of critical and emerging technologies and particularly the China-Pakistan collusion.
Hmm.
And I think this is something that India, at least theoretically, played out in its national security thinking as to how India always need to be looking at a two-front scenario. The China-Pakistan collusion was always seen as a possibility, and there have been, China has given assistance to Pakistan even in the past conflicts, but not to the extent that we did see during this particular conflict. The assistance was in terms of the fighter jets that they were flying, signals intelligence, operational intelligence, which was
Hmm.
even more critical to give them the critical operational tactical intelligence of whereabout the Indian forces. China's air-to-air missiles, again, quite effective, and so on and so forth. And of course, the diplomatic support that Pakistan continued to gain from China, the moral and political support, diplomatic support, I think all of that was very, very clear. Again, this is an issue that, like I said, India has always wondered, and kind of India acknowledges that it is a reality. But
Yeah.
again, India is not certain that it has very many options in terms of how you deal with it.
Hmm.
Because to me, it seems like, and this has been the case for a very long time, at least from the 1960s, that both both China and Pakistan have deep political, historical angst against India. And so both would want to have, would collaborate in a way that would put India at a disadvantage strategically, tactically, and any way it can, in a sense. So is there something that India can effectively do in managing the China-Pakistan collusion? China has sometime in the past talked about as to how the India-China relations are important, and it will not let Pakistan come in the way of building a strong. Yeah, that's all nice to talk about when the two leaders meet and so on and so forth. But I don't think that's one area that they would give up, because that's effectively a tool. Pakistan is effectively a tool for China to kind of keep India off the balance forever in Southern Asia. So yeah, that's not something that China and Pakistan are ever going to give up. And that's
Mm.
not an issue. Even as India realizes that it is a reality that India has to confront, it doesn't have very many options to deal with effectively, in a sense.
Yeah. One of the hypotheses that I've heard about that effectiveness, right, is yes, from what we've seen in open source accounts, there was active cooperation between China and Pakistan that was playing out. But to an
Yeah.
extent, it's also part and parcel of, what the Chinese would say, I think, is that this is a system of systems that Pakistan has bought into in being so invested in Chinese origin hardware. And perhaps one of the challenges that India is running into is interoperability, right?
Yeah.
And we think
Yeah.
about that usually in terms of alliance and partnership dynamics, but actually just
Yeah.
within India's own, its own arsenal, it's difficult perhaps
Yeah.
to ensure that all of the systems are working together properly. Do you think that that had an effect here? Was that something that we saw play out in the crisis in a meaningful way?
No, it did not have that kind of an impeding effect this time around during the conflict. But I think that is really a challenge that India needs to think through, and India needs to consolidate its kind of hardware, where it is coming from, where it is buying from, and whether, because in terms of its ability to interoperability between different platforms,
Mm-hmm.
how well connected all the communication systems and the ISR platforms all between various platforms. That is number one. Second is in terms of the maintenance of multiple workshops, literally to say, to maintain this very different hardware. So the kind of logistics and the entire networks that India needs to maintain a wide variety of platforms is so significant. And I think India does recognize the pitfalls of doing that. And I think there has been an effort in the past, at least 10, 15 years, to change its procurement pattern to one to limit the Russian platforms in India's defense inventory and focus more on Western platforms. So it's whether from the US or from the French or generally some European options, Israeli options, and so on and so forth. So India has been trying to consolidate by and large in the last last decade plus. So it's an effort that is going on as an ongoing process. But I think considering the kind of legacy issue involved in the kind of platforms that India has, and for the decades of dependence on a single source has created a bit of a lot more challenging a situation for India to kind of walk away from it overnight. So even after 15 years, it hasn't been able to do that effectively.
Yeah.
I think India still has something like anywhere from 70 or 75% to 85% Soviet/Russian component in the Indian defense inventory. And that's a huge dependence. So it does place limitations in terms of creating a synergized force, the interoperability among the different forces, different platforms. But I think this is something that India does recognize, but it did not have a hampering effect. I don't believe it did have a hampering effect this time around during the crisis.
That's really helpful. I can't not ask this question. What role, if any, do you think that nuclear weapons played in this crisis? Certainly, that was top of mind for me watching this from Washington, D.C. I will say I've heard some analysis from the region that actually nuclear weapons didn't play a huge role in the crisis. Where do you come down on that? And what do you make of that, whichever way you fall?
No, I think I tend to generally see that nuclear weapons did not play a big role, because I think in the past, I think, like I said, like we started off by saying that nuclear was at the center of any India-Pakistan crisis, because any terrorist attack and immediately knowing fully well that India would respond, typically a Pakistani defense minister would come out and make a statement: we will use Pakistani tactical nuclear weapons against India. That immediately restricted India's hand in terms of what options it did have against Pakistan. But I think the fact that you don't see that kind of having that same level of effect it did have in the past, Pakistan also has come to realize that that's not an effective tool any longer, and therefore now you're actually seeing India escalating step by step at with each of the crises. And so using the nuclear card is not going to put a stop in terms of India's ability to carry out an escalation, retaliatory strikes. So I think both sides have repeatedly now shown that they do have the capacity to engage in a conventional conflict, and they don't have to bring in nuclear weapons into that dynamics. They don't have to make it into a much wider, prolonged conflict. And I think prolonged conflict, I think that's a point I want to make again. If you think about a prolonged conflict, that is where I think India will continue to have an advantage. When you have short bursts of conflict, like 2 or 3 days, I think that's where Pakistan flourishes well. Pakistan does best because, one, they are looking at responding. They're already prepared to respond to an Indian retaliation. So they're always, and those are the first 1 or 2 days after a nuclear attack. And so they are prepared. They know what to kind of expect. And therefore, and they have 1 or 2, systems, fighter jets and systems in their inventory that have generally worked well for a short duration conflict. But prolonged conflicts, given the overall India's conventional superiority, conventional weapon superiority, I don't think India would have a difficulty. If India were to initiate a war, India will have much wider set of options to use, and India will come out
Mhm.
with a more gains in such an option. And I think therefore I would go to say it is not therefore in Pakistan's interest to prolong a war,
Mhm.
prolong the conflict in a sense. They can engage in short conflicts. That's where they excel in some ways, because they intend to use one or two of those systems that have been effective in the past in shooting down, again, shooting down planes. That does happen during conflicts.
Yeah.
And I think the Indian military leadership, again, has also talked about as to how these are part and parcel of any conflict when it happens. There are likely to be
Mhm.
losses of a kind in a sense. But again, what the Indian leadership, military leadership took away in terms of the lessons and why did they lose, how did they lose it, how do you get back on the
Yeah.
game. And I think that was, I think, what happened for 2 nights in a sense. And the third night and the ninth night, you did see the airstrikes on Pakistan airbase. And so prolonged war is in India's favor,
Yeah.
and a short war is always in Pakistan's favor. But I think both sides do recognize that they can find ways to fight a conventional war, and that need not result in the use of nuclear weapons. So
Mhm.
nuclear weapons really did not have
Yeah.
much of a role to play in this conflict as well.
And indeed, after this, right, we've seen the formation of Pakistan's Army Rocket Force. So it seems like there is a recognition of a need to build out more conventional capabilities. To my mind, the question is still out there of how sustainable, how stable we will see potential limited conventional conflict under a nuclear umbrella, right? Like it is
Yeah,
still operating this context, as you said,
yeah.
but that does seem to be a key piece of learning out of this. I want to use our last few minutes here to talk a little bit about some of the lessons learned, and particularly on managing crises like this, and reflecting back on the Cold War dynamics that you were talking about. Obviously, the Cuban Missile Crisis is just the gold standard in so many ways for thinking about what the origin of some of these crisis communication mechanisms and CBM development and arms control talks. Um, it was a really scary time. And out of that was a recognition that we need more connective tissue than we had. Um, is that a dynamic that is at play here at all? You referenced earlier kind of the lack of some of those communication channels. What is your sense of what was operational during the crisis, and whether and how we might be able to get to something that's a little bit more fulsome between the two sides or with an intermediary?
Um, I think the during the conflict itself, I think on the Indian side, they were fairly okay. Pakistan was doing its own business. India was doing its own kind of communication. But the communication between the two sides, I'm not sure. There's a lot of it's a lot of reports out there, but it's also, again, you don't know which ones are the most credible ones to go with. So the kind of communication issues, that I think that's something that is still persisting. And I think this is one of those times when, like I said earlier, information warfare was at its peak, or misinformation, disinformation was at its peak, and you can call it by hybrid war and whatever hybrid strategy, whichever
Mm-hmm.
way you want to call it. But the fact is that I think that's something that really played out, and um, I'm not sure we have. But I think that's where there comes the role of the US in a sense.
Mm.
Um, US has always played an important role in managing the conflict, in bringing down the temperatures, in bringing the conflict to an end, in all of that, whether it is 1999 Kargil
Yeah.
war that you're looking at or any subsequent crisis. But of course, the previous US leaderships have shown a lot of discretion in how they talk about it, how they play it up or downplay it in a sense. And I think that was something that was missing. With the
Mm-hmm.
Trump administration, it was everything was like, shouting from the rooftop and making an announcement that the US did mediate. And again, if anybody who has done a bit of India Pakistan would know that mediation is the most sensitive word and you don't want to use it. You can say that, okay, we managed to bring down the temperatures. It was,
Yeah.
you can put this in very many different ways.
Yes.
But some words are better not used, and unnecessarily you're kind of creating more tensions and kind of thing. But I think that's been a bit of a problem with the Trump administration in a sense. And I don't know. Hopefully, there won't be another crisis that we
Hmm.
need to manage in the next 3 years,
Yes.
because I think that can give away. I know that can be a seriously challenging phase. But I
Yes.
think that generally, otherwise, U.S. did play always an important role in
Hmm.
stabilizing the India-Pakistan conflict front, and I think that is something that India would continue to look at also. Um, Again, in for India, I think especially the US cooperation. So
Hmm.
India needs to work with its critical partners like the US in a big way, because I think the cooperating with the US, especially in terms of intel collaboration, is
Hmm.
particularly important for India if it wants to gain an upper hand in during a conflict and kind of thing. So that's extremely vital. So, and that of course comes from a close political and strategic partnership between India and the US. So India is, I think, mindful despite the current phase that we are going through, a bit of a patchy phase, trouble phase that we are going through, India and the US relationship.
Hmm.
But I think, nevertheless, I think India still is conscious of the fact that it needs the US on its side.
Yeah.
I think that is very, very clear. So it is trying to manage the relationship in a manner, in a way that it is not going to create long lasting damages and so on and so forth. But yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. No, that's really helpful, and I think something to watch going forward, right?
Yep.
God willing, there will not be a next crisis, but if and when there is, the lessons that not just the two sides, but third parties have taken
Yeah.
in by
Yeah.
virtue of
Yeah.
how this played out.
Yeah.
Hopefully, we will not have occasion to talk about that going forward, and stability will prevail. Um, what a delight it has been, Rajiv, to have this conversation with you. Time has flown by. I have a million more questions, but we'll have to save them for a follow-up conversation if you'll be so kind at some point. But
Yeah, absolutely. But
thank
I
you
think,
so much.
yeah, absolutely. No, yeah, there are a couple of like important lessons that India is kind of taking away from. One is,
Huh.
of course, the narrative war. Second is India is only beginning to now figure that India can actually use air power in an effective fashion.
Mm,
And I think so there has to be strengthening of the Indian air power. And right now we have something like the out of the supposedly sanctioned 42 fighter squadron, we have something like 31 at
yeah.
this point of time. So India has to get its act together in terms of the procurement process and building up the air power. But also the other thing that India is to learn, and now because last few days I was also reading a lot of the commentary, inter-service rivalry. It's
Uh,
already playing out in terms of the op-eds and commentary, calling out each other, one service calling out the other, and I think here is where the political leadership has to take a ownership of this in this
mhm.
and intervene, think through the importance of this, and work on it rather than let this kind of inter-service rivalry fester. So
Yeah.
those are kind of things important to kind of look at for the future,
Hmm.
because if you want to manage your conflict well and kind of thing, I think these are important issues.
I'm so
Yeah,
glad you raised
absolutely.
that. And it brings to mind for me creating the environment where you can do an honest assessment, even if it
Yeah,
is a private
exactly.
honest assessment of what played out and where some of the
Exactly.
shortcomings were, uh,
Absolutely.
so that you're learning, have the opportunity to learn from what actually played out rather than
Right.
interpretations thereof.
Exactly.
Well, much to discuss going forward.
Yeah.
But Dr. Rajagopalan, thank you so much again for taking the time and for being our very first guest on Strategic Dialogues. I think you've set a high bar for the future. So
Uh,
hopefully our future guests will be able to clear it. But thanks again for making us smarter and sharing your thoughts on this important issue.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. This is an absolute pleasure to talk to you, and such important subjects to talk about and discuss. Absolutely. Thank you.
Yes. And thank you to all of you who are tuning in to watch this conversation play out. If you liked what you hear, Please do subscribe to Strategic Learning's YouTube channel. Check out the rest of our offerings, including our suite of free online courses at stratlearning.org. And check back often for next episodes. We'll be doing these once a month, and we'd welcome your thoughts and suggestions on whom else we should invite onto Strategic Dialogues. But until next time, many thanks again, and be well.